Yes, good morning, everyone. Welcome on behalf of the Holy Land Committee. I'm Kirk Campbell, one of the co-conveners, along with Nancy Adams, and we're really happy to present to you the second of our three-part series on justice in the Holy Land. Last week we had Reverend Brian Greaves, who spoke about Episcopal Church policy dating back to the first General Convention in 1949. And of course, that session is recorded like all our sessions. So if you missed that, you can go back and view it. And today we're pleased to present Cristofalo. He's the Senior Advocacy and Government Relations Specialist for Churches for Middle East Peace. And he's going to talk a little bit about how CMEP sees the situation in the Holy Land, and particularly Israel-Palestine, so that we can better understand how their assessment drives their strategy. And we'll learn more about what that strategy is for working toward justice in the Holy Land and some of the actions that CMEP is taking. And just briefly about our relationship with Churches for Middle East Peace, since we invited Kyle here today, everyone should hopefully understand that the Episcopal Church is a member of CMEP, one of 27, I think it is, national churches and organizations that partner with CMEP. And we, St. John's Norwood, recently joined as a member partner. And so today, just regarding kind of the agenda and the way things will proceed here, I'll introduce Kyle in a moment, and then he'll speak for about 25 or 30 minutes and take questions. And if you want to ask a question, you should see a tool in your Zoom window where you can raise your hand if you want to ask, and I'll call on you. Or you can also click on the chat box and type your question out in the chat window, and I'll get to it there as well. So now just a little more about Kyle. He's, in addition to being the government relations specialist at CMEP, he's also the special advisor to Reverend Mayelise Cannon. And she spoke with us at St. John's last October, many of you will remember. Kyle holds a bachelor's degree in Peace and Conflict Studies from Messiah College and a Master of Divinity from Emory. He was first introduced to Middle East advocacy work during a semester abroad in Cairo, and he's also worked in Bethlehem, Palestine, working with the Mennonite Central Committee there. And most recently, before joining CMEP, Kyle served as the program assistant for Middle East policy at the Friends Committee on Legislation. And among the things he did there was working to train grassroots advocates on how to lobby congressional representatives. Kyle, again, we're very happy to have you with us here today, and I'll just turn the floor over to you for your talk.
Thank you, Kirk, and I'm really happy to be with you all this morning. I regret it can't be in person, but obviously understand, and we at CMEP are holding all of folks in our network in prayer, and I hope that you all are staying healthy and safe, and that your family is staying healthy and safe despite these challenging times. So I look forward to, at a point in the future, I know both myself and May being able to be with you in person again, but we're grateful for Zoom and technology in the interim. Thank you, Kirk, for that introduction. And I did want to start just briefly sort of explaining how I got to my role and how I got to the work that I'm doing. And as Kirk mentioned, really a defining factor for me was that study abroad semester that I did in Cairo. I wanted to pick a semester abroad location that I was not likely to travel to on my own or get in another way. And so I decided, without knowing much about what was happening in the Middle East at all, to study abroad in Cairo. In that semester, through that semester, we had the opportunity to travel throughout the Middle East. So we were based in Cairo, spent 2 months in Cairo, and then a month traveling throughout the region. So we were able to go to Turkey, Jordan, Syria, and then finally Israel, Palestine. This was all pre-Arab Spring. And being in Israel, Palestine, it was our last trip, location for the trip for that month of travel. It happened to correspond with with a big pilgrimage from an organization called Christians United for Israel. If you're familiar with them, Kufi, they're actually the largest pro-Israel group in the US with, I believe, over 8 million members. And I had no previous knowledge of who they were or really anything about sort of this long-standing support for the state of Israel embedded within a theology of Christian Zionism. And I'm not an expert in that. I'm not going to talk a lot about theology today, but that was really something that I wanted to know more about. And so when I went back to school, I did my senior project on Christian Zionism and Christians United for Israel, and then decided that I wanted to go back to the Middle East for a term through the Mennonite Central Committee. I did a year of volunteer service, and I wanted to get back to Cairo. I wasn't really keen on getting back to Israel, Palestine. I knew it was a very heavy place, and I really wanted to get back to Cairo, but there wasn't a position open in Cairo, but there was one at Bethlehem, at the Bethlehem Bible College. And so that's what got me back to the region, where I worked at Bethlehem Bible College, assisting the director of their humanitarian office, the Shepherd Society, and working with their social workers, and was convicted through that year of being exposed more to the realities on the ground that I needed to be back in the US and advocating both within my government, the government structures, but also within my faith community to really push for a posture from, again, both the US policy and also the Christian faith community of one that would help bring about a just and lasting end to the conflict in Israel, Palestine. So now I've been here in DC for about 6 years and at CMEP for a little over 3 years, where I direct our government relations as well as our coalition work and advise the executive director who as Kirk mentioned, spoke with the church in October. So Churches for Middle East Peace, as Kirk mentioned, we're a coalition of now close to 30 national Christian organizations and communions that are spread across the theological spectrum. Most of the mainline Protestant church, the Episcopal Church, has been a foundational and important member since our beginning. We also have Catholic, Orthodox, some evangelical denominations and groups, and historic peace churches. And so it is quite diverse, as you can imagine. I like to say that we go from the Conference of Catholic Bishops to the Unitarian Universalists. So a lot of our member communions might disagree on particular theology or social issues, but have come together around policy positions related to the Middle East. And again, I'll get to those later. But we were founded now 36 years ago, and the idea was that there were denominations that were connected a bit through the National Council of Churches working on Middle East policy, but there was really the feeling that the positions of these denominations were not well represented in US policy, and also the understanding that each of these denominations on their own couldn't have a full-time staff person in Washington, DC, focusing on Middle East policy. And so the idea was to come together with a coalition that could speak with an ecumenical voice that could represent the member communities on Israel, Palestine, as well as the Middle East as a whole. I would say about 80% of our work focuses on Israel, Palestine, but we're also connected throughout the region and understand that nothing happens in a vacuum. So we're concerned about what's happening in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. Our executive director made her first trip to Iraqi Kurdistan late, and actually probably soon after she was with you all. She made a trip out to the Middle East and included Iraqi Kurdistan, where we visited with some partners and other Christian denominations. So what is CMEP's overall strategy for pursuing social justice? Well, we work to mobilize US Christians to embrace a holistic perspective and to be advocates of equality, human rights, security, and justice for Israelis, Palestinians, and all peoples of the Middle East. We do this through a three-pronged approach: educate, elevate, and advocate. So we feel that one of our most instrumental purposes that we serve is to educate our network, which is primarily US Christians that are members of the various denominations and organizations that comprise CMEP, but to educate US Christians on what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. And so we do that through a variety of ways: speaking to churches. We like to in pre-COVID times, and we are looking forward to being able to do it again, but bringing peace builders, peacemakers from the region to churches in the US and other parts of the US through our Pilgrimage to Peace tour. So we usually do this biannually, where we bring an Israeli and a Palestinian to speak at churches, colleges, civic society, a broad spectrum of places to educate them on what's happening in the region. So we're elevating the voices of peacemakers in the region, working toward a holistic approach to the conflict. And Elevate happens through those programs that I talked about before, of bringing Palestinians and Israelis to the US, but also through webinars that we lead. We do trips to the region for churches. So if you go through CMEP, one of the ways that we elevate the voices of peacemakers is making sure that trips are not just pilgrimage trips. Of course, that's an important component for many of the people that want to visit the Holy Land. And as a Christian organization, all of our trips to Israel, Palestine would include the holy sites, but making sure that you also get introduced to the living stones, the Christians and other people that are in Israel, Palestine, that are working again on behalf of a just and holistic approach to the conflict. And then advocating with policymakers. So this includes equipping and encouraging our network to advocate with their members of Congress, and also my role as the Director of Government Relations in building relationships with congressional offices, ensuring that they're aware of CMEP's policy positions, and helping to shape US policy in a way that will bring about a just and lasting end to the conflict. So what are we advocating for? US policies that will actively promote a comprehensive resolution to conflicts in the Middle East, again with a focus on Israel-Palestine. And we break down our advocacy priorities into three priorities. So holistic peace building, humanitarian and economic assistance, and human rights. So holistic peace building, as a Christian organization, we are concerned about the sustainability of the Christian community in the Middle East. And so that is a key concern that we work under through holistic peace building. Was one of the reasons why, again, our executive director went to Iraqi Kurdistan to meet with the Christians in Iraq and to hear some of the challenges that they continue to face. Here it also means that we really are looking for US policies that will help result in a just and lasting end to the conflict, and one that will result in the realization of human rights and equality for all, for Israelis and for Palestinians. So we don't want there to be US policies that would privilege one person, one people group over the other, whichever way that may be. We really want to be pushing for policies that, again, will result in an end to the conflict that is just, that is durable, that will result in Israelis and Palestinians being able to live together in peace, justice, equality, and security. Humanitarian and economic assistance. This is a big issue for us. As you may be familiar, over the past few years in this current administration, there has been a complete cutoff of aid of US economic assistance to the West Bank and Gaza. Traditionally, the US has provided fairly robust economic and humanitarian support to the West Bank and Gaza through two primary streams. So one has gone directly to INGOs and humanitarian groups on the ground, does not go to the Palestinian Authority or any government official. It is through the State Department and US Aid, and it goes to groups such as Catholic Relief Services, CARE, Mercy Corps, large-scale INGOs that are offering humanitarian economic assistance to the most vulnerable Palestinians. I'm sure that you all have maybe heard in your last session or in other sessions are familiar with the East Jerusalem Hospital Network. It includes an Anglican hospital in Jerusalem. There's obviously also the Al-Ahi, the Anglican hospital in Gaza that has been provided with US support. The East Jerusalem Hospital Network is the one place where the funding actually does go directly to the PA, and then the PA provides the funding to the hospitals, but that is through an agreement that the US government has come to with them. So that's one stream of funding. The second stream of funding is to UNRWA, which is the UN agency that provides emergency relief and assistance to the more than 5 million Palestinian refugees that are spread out across the Middle East. So that includes refugees, Palestinian refugees that are in the West Bank and Gaza. There are Palestinian refugee camps in Bethlehem and other parts of the West Bank. But it also includes Palestinians who fled in either 1948 or 1967 and settled in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And despite especially the struggles that have been in Syria over the past several years with their civil war, there remain Palestinian refugees in Syria. And so UNRWA has provided these refugees with really emergency food support, education, healthcare, job trainings, jobs in general. Many of the host countries have made it challenging for Palestinian refugees that are settled there to work, to live in certain places. And so UNRWA helps provide really emergency assistance that is needed because they face considerable disadvantages and targeting in some cases from the government. So we have provided that assistance. We generally have provided about a third actually of the overall budget for UNRWA. And that was another stream of funding that the Trump administration cut off within the past 2 years. So we have been working with other humanitarian organizations, other NGOs, religious groups to encourage, this is all money that's appropriated by Congress, but the way that it's written into the appropriations bills is that the president is able to, under certain circumstances, reprogram the funding for other parts of the Middle East if he deems it necessary. And so we've been working with congressional offices and other humanitarian groups to ensure that funding can get back to the region. I think regardless of political views, it has been long held US policy that humanitarian assistance should go to the most needy and should not be at all a partisan or political issue. And so it's been troublesome to see the stoppage of that assistance. And we've been encouraged by congressional voices. I know many of you are coming from Maryland, so Senator Chris Van Hollen has been very active on this issue, for example, as well as some of the Maryland members of the House, but really pushing so that this money can be reinstated. There was $225 million that was included in the appropriations bill on the House side. The appropriations bill is moving through Congress at the moment. It has to still be voted on by the House, the full House. It passed out of the appropriations committee, and it did have $225 million for humanitarian assistance and economic assistance to the West Bank and Gaza. It did last year as well, and then it didn't make it into the Senate version. So we're in this situation where we have to make sure that as the Senate takes up the appropriations bill, they will include that money, and it would be then included in the final appropriations bill that passes both the House and the Senate. And then our last issue, the last priority is human rights. And so that's quite broad, but it includes work that we've been doing around the treatment of Palestinian children in Israeli military detention centers. There's active legislation that's been introduced by Congresswoman Betty McCollum from Minnesota on that issue that I'm happy to talk about later if there are questions. Access to holy sites, and that is for Christian, Jews, and Muslims, for all religious believers to have the full and equal access to their holy sites. Freedom of movement, sort of beyond even just access to holy sites, issue of access to water and electricity, and that's particularly an issue in Gaza. And right now, the focus with human rights has been around annexation. And that is really our primary engagement at the moment, and what we see as the most pressing issue on the ground right now that is causing us to move very firmly. I don't know how much you all have been looking at this issue particularly, but annexation has to do with extending official Israeli law and recognition to parts of the settlements that are in the West Bank. So this would, the Oslo Accords back in the 90s broke up the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. And for our purposes, what matters, what's the most important is area C. And those are where there are Israeli settlements that are in that portion of the West Bank. It's also very resource heavy. So one of the areas in Area C is the Jordan Valley, which has access to really a lot of the resources that would be critical if there were a future Palestinian state. So for a while now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been talking about, in Israel they would say, or Prime Minister Netanyahu would say, extending Israeli sovereignty. So officially recognizing that these areas that have long been assumed would have to be negotiated in a final agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians around borders, but that they would become officially part of Israel. And this would be unilateral. So again, not part of a bilateral or multilateral agreement. The Prime Minister could have moved as early as July 1. To make this official. It would have to go through the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, where there is generally support. The extent of the support does depend on the political party, but there's a lot of uncertainty. So there could be, some of it has talked about as much as 30% of Area C would be annexed. There are other possibilities that would have smaller areas that would be annexed. So that is unclear at the moment. What's important to know is that annexation, at least in some form, was green-lighted by the Trump administration's peace proposal on Israel-Palestine that was released at the end of January. So that did give way for there to be formal annexation, at least in some form. And it included a US and Israeli mapping commission that was charged with coming up with the maps of Israel-Palestine that would show which of the parts of the West Bank would become annexed. So this has been a deep concern for us. So far, Netanyahu has not announced any movement within the Knesset regarding annexation, and we can get more into that later if there are questions as to why. I think the international pressure has been significant. Also, the rise in COVID cases, Israel had it under control for a while, and then recently has had to go back into some more lockdowns. So there's obviously a lot of issues at play beyond annexation itself. But we've been joining a broad group of concerned actors, including Jewish, Christian, Muslim, secular organizations that have called out our concern on this issue. We have a campaign that you all might be familiar with, but I'll drop it in the chat, called Churches Against Annexation, and it provides some additional information, background information on what annexation is, what it might look like, why we're concerned. It would have a devastating impact on Palestinian human rights. It would really create a system in which Palestinians have no say. So what Netanyahu has said is that any land that would be annexed, if Palestinians remained in those lands, they would not be given Israeli citizenship or rights. So even though that land would be considered Israel proper by the government of Israel, any Palestinians that reside in it would not be given citizenship. And so that is particularly troublesome. It's possible that there would be no Palestinians in that land, that they might displace them and force them to move to area A or B, which would remain, more or less under Palestinian control. So there's a lot of issues that we have found concerning about annexation. And again, what I dropped in the chat gives a bit of a background there. There was a letter that was sent by 27 church leaders, heads of communion, that I can also drop in the chat in early June, which included the signature of Presiding Bishop Curry, and again lays out the concerns that we have with annexation and why we would encourage the US government to take a different approach in their relationship with the Israelis and the Palestinians. So it has been making a lot of as I said before, there's been a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. It's been coming up in a lot of conversations on Capitol Hill. There have been a number of letters that have been sent. At this point, it has become, sadly, a partisan issue. We really think that it shouldn't be, but there were 191 Democrats that wrote a letter that I also will drop in the chat to Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz, sharing their concerns around annexation. We've also have Senator Van Hollen co-led a letter with Senators Kaine from Virginia, if any folks are joining from Virginia, as well as Senator Murphy from Connecticut, talking about again, the impact of annexation and cautioning against it. So I can drop that in the chat. There was a much stronger letter that some of you might have seen sent by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, and she was joined by 12 members, including Senator Sanders. So it was bicameral. That went much farther than any other letter had before, really threatening that if annexation proceeds, they would consider introducing legislation that might condition US aid to Israel based off of if they moved forward with annexation. So those are the Democratic letters, and then there have been a couple, as I said, Republican letters that have essentially said that the decision on borders and whether to annex is Israel's, and that they would stand by and support whatever decision they make. So I'll drop some of those now in the chat, and those have been in the House as well as the Senate. The last thing on annexation, and it again brings us back to Senator Van Hollen, is the Congress is currently considering the yearly defense bill. So this is must-pass legislation. It's called the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And Senator Van Hollen has offered an amendment to that act that would prohibit Israel from using US security assistance funds to unilaterally annex Palestinian territory in the West Bank. It would not impact the overall 3.8 billion in annual foreign military financing and missile defense support to Israel, but it would say that Israel cannot use those funds in the service of unilateral annexation. So it was introduced by Senator Van Hollen with 12 other Senate Democrats, including Senator Kaine. It's pretty significant that this has happened. The Senate is getting back from its recess tomorrow, and will probably start to consider the NDAA as soon as Tuesday. And so seeing this is, I think, encouraging, and that this is not a conversation that could have even happened 3, 4, 5 years ago. And certainly it is just the beginning of the conversation. It's 12 Democrats along with Mr. Van Hollen. So certainly there are a lot of senators, and again, we think that this should be a bipartisan issue. So we're troubled that so far only Democrats have spoken out, but even to get to the point where this amendment is introduced and that there are, a significant number so far of senators that have added their name, we think is a good sign. I can continue on, but I don't know if now is maybe a good place to stop just to see if there are any questions. And then again, I have more to say, but I know it's hard to just listen.
So Kyle, I think that's, you did a really great job of laying out Churches for Middle East Peace, kind of like strategic overview of how you see the Middle East and the Holy Land and what kind of actions you're taking, as well as bringing us up to some pretty urgent, current issues that are going on, including from a policy perspective on that. And so I would like to open it up to questions now. And I know I have a few, but if there aren't that many questions, then you can add some additional thoughts that you might have. And just as a reminder to everybody, you can, I think there's a reaction button in your Zoom window. If you click on that, you can click on the hand and raise your hand, and I'll call on you to ask a question, or you can just drop your question into the chat room. But I'll go ahead and start. I'll just ask one question to start out with, and that is, I saw recently, I was kind of surprised by this. I saw in a recent Jewish Currents article that May Cannon herself grew up a Christian Zionist. And we recently had a forum on reclaiming Judaism from Zionism, so I was really intrigued by this. Anyway, so May Cannon grew up a Christian Zionist in a very evangelical family, and it was only through, according to this account, through personal travel to the Holy Land, and I think specifically on this trip back in 2009, she went to Bethlehem, and it was some of the things that she saw that opened her mind or opened her eyes, and she began rethinking how she had seen the Israel-Palestine issue. And so I was going to ask you about that from the standpoint of your own kind of personal transformation. And you did, at the beginning of your talk, you said a few things about how, your own engagement on these issues developed out of that. And I was just wondering if you could add on, if there were particular things that you saw that really struck you that you didn't include in your narrative earlier that you could highlight. Because, and I'm asking this in part because in my perception, the American media portrayal of things is still kind of reflexively pro-Israeli in terms of issues like justice and, there's a political correctness, maybe to a two-state solution, but the narrative is often kind of privileges the idea of Israeli security over, justice for Palestinians. And so, other than travel to the Middle East, to the region, I don't see it seems difficult for people to see the Palestinian perspective. And so that's why I'm asking this question.
Yeah, thanks. I think that that's an important question. And so many of the people that I have met over the past 10, 12 years that are passionate about this issue, it maybe doesn't always start with a trip to the region, but that is the sort of ignition that really they point to as what motivates them to be engaged. So for me, I really felt that I was pretty much a blank slate. Like I said, sort of in the beginning, I chose to study abroad in the Middle East because I wanted to go somewhere that, I wouldn't on my own. And so I figured there would be chances to go to Europe, in my future. And so I chose the Middle East, and I didn't really know much about the Middle East. I grew up in a fairly non-political home. I was, raised in the church, and I knew that there were some, close church friends that had volunteered in Israel, but it wasn't something that was spoken about much or from the pulpit. So I didn't have a real understanding of the region. I was mostly focused on domestic issues. And I do remember, though, and I don't know sort of where this came from. I was in high school in 9/11, and I grew up outside of New York City. And I just remember thinking to myself, well, this is what Israel has to deal with every day, So I had made that connection, I think, just because of media and other, because I wasn't really engaged with the issue, but I had the sense that this, hostility that we were experiencing was something that was, that the people of Israel had to deal with, given where they were. But yeah, so for me, really going, it was of course seeing the Palestinians and the wall, and hearing from Israelis as well who were working and committed to a just and lasting end to the conflict. But I think what was really instrumental for me was seeing those, and I don't want to make this, into the Christian Zionism or a theology conversation necessarily, but it was seeing that this was just busloads of pilgrims from Christians United for Israel that were there, and we ran into some of them at various holy sites that we were at, and hearing their perspectives on how they were scared for us because we went and talked to the Palestinians. And for me, that was a moment where I was like, what is going on? Why is this such a, it seems like as Christians, we should be supporting everyone. We should be working towards peace. I was a bit naive, I guess. And that really, for me, sort of I wanted to do more research. I wanted to understand more why this was such a contentious issue, even within Christianity. And there were differences of opinion on whether we had to support Israel unequivocally because of the Bible, or whether the Palestinians, we had to support them as, especially the Christians in the region. So that was, I think, instrumental for me. And then seeing the ways in which US policy also were not, both from Democrats and Republicans. This has been a bipartisan issue where members of Congress and previous administrations from both sides of the aisle, from both parties, have not handled our policy, I think, in a proactive and productive manner. So that really, I felt indicted as an American and as a Christian, that I needed to really devote myself to do the work to help, again, bring about education on this issue, but really in support of both the Israelis that I had met that were working for peace and justice, as well as the Palestinians who were working for peace and justice.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, we have some questions in the chat room now, so let me go to the first of those. This is from the Healy family, and they ask, you cited Senator Chris Van Hollen frequently, whose positions seem helpful. On the other hand, it is my understanding that Senator Cardin has offered very problematic legislation. Can you help understand the positions taken by Maryland's other senator, and Cardin?
Yes, so certainly Mr. Cardin and Mr. Van Hollen do not have the same opinions in a lot of ways on these issues. I mean, they're both supportive of the MOU, and I think the security assistance that we give to Israel But Senator Cardin has over the years been resistant to positions that we think are helpful, certainly has taken a more I don't like saying pro-Israel because I think that the work that we're doing is in support of Israelis and Palestinians, but traditionally assumed to be pro-Israel views around security assistance, around issues related to ensuring that the U.S. remains, firmly supportive of the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Senator Cardin did release a statement in opposition to annexation that was with Senator Schumer and Menendez from New Jersey, and it was there are three of the sort of thought to be the three probably most quote unquote pro-Israel senators, and I do think that's important and was good to see. I linked to that statement there. I would encourage you all to read it. He has, however, he did not support the letter that I referenced earlier that Senator Van Hollen led. He came out against it publicly, and there were some changes to the letter, but his thinking seems to be that it's better to have those conversations in private, that if there are disputes or disagreements with Israel, we should do them directly. Of course, now this letter that he signed on to was released. It was not written to anyone in particular. It was just a statement, not a letter. But I did think that that was a good sign. He also is not supportive, as far as I have heard, of the Van Hollen amendment that I mentioned earlier. So he does traditionally, again, seem to take the positions that are viewed as pro-Israel.
Thank you. We have another question here. This is from Rob and Ruth Hartman. And they say, I know that former President Jimmy Carter has been a great supporter of Palestinian rights, and his organization has monitored most elections. But why isn't he more verbal in his support with mainstream media, especially current corruption in the Israeli government?
Yeah, I mean, I can do my best to answer that. I don't know. He did receive a lot of pushback when he released his book, Peace Not Apartheid. I'm trying to, I don't recall the year that was released, so looked it up in 2006. I know that he received quite a bit of pushback in that regard, so I'm not sure if it has anything to do with that. He did release a statement opposing annexation that I saw, but I don't really know any insight or backstory other than perhaps it could be related to some of the pushback that he received as a result of that book.
Thank you. And a question from Rodney now. The CMEP have projects in advocating for freedom and human rights in the areas under control of the Palestinian Authority or Hamas.
So yeah, I mean, our policy positions, and I can link to them, or I can send them in a follow-up, relate to the whole of the Middle East, and including areas that are under control. So the Gaza Strip would be under the control of Hamas, as well as the Palestinian Authority. I mean, the way that it works is that the Palestinian Authority really is not in full control anywhere, but in reality, that they're not really in control fully anywhere. But I don't know if the question is, do we express disappointment in the actions of the PA or Hamas? Yes, is the answer. You know, if rights are threatened by anyone in the Middle East, we speak out, and so we have spoken out against some of the unhelpful statements that the Palestinian Authority has released in the past. We take very seriously, one of our policy positions is to stand very strongly against anti-Semitism. So there were statements that Mahmoud Abbas has made that were clearly anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, that we spoke out against. We have done some, private work in other regards around some of the other actions that have gone on. We were also critical of, there has been within the Palestinian Authority, for sure, some crackdown on the rights of Palestinians who are trying to be critical of Palestinian Authority and censorship around media and journalists and other advocates. And so we've worked with folks in that regard as well.
Thank you. Let me ask you a question. This is something that we on the Holy Land Committee, and I'm sure you at CMEP grapple with quite often, and that's, and we're asked about this as well, and it's it's this idea of maintaining a distinction between working for justice and helping the weak, the marginalized, and the oppressed, as opposed to helping one side or group as opposed to the other side in a conflict. And so just wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit more about that. I know you touched on it, but how do you deal with this at CMEP?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. For us, as I noted earlier, our work is really rooted in wanting to see a solution to this conflict that will result in justice and equality and human rights for all. And so that's how we really approach every issue. For us, some of the policies, if we're speaking out against them, so I'll use the issue of the treatment of Palestinian children in Israeli military detention, the bill that was introduced by Congresswoman McCollum on this matter has to deal, just very briefly, any child in the West Bank that is accused of any infraction, could be throwing stones, could be something that's more serious. They immediately go through a military detention. There is no juvenile justice system for them. And there has been, it's well documented that they have suffered abuse, physical, mental abuse. They're often taken from their homes in the middle of the night, taken into Israel proper in a place where their parents can't get to them. They often end up signing documents of guilt, confessions in Hebrew, which is a language that they more than likely don't read or write. So we've been very vocal about this issue, trying to bring attention to it, supporting Congresswoman McCollum's legislation, which would ensure no US funds are used to support this practice. But we also see this as something that is not helpful to the Israelis. That sadly, because of the occupation and where things have ended up, for many Palestinians, their only engagement with Israelis is through the military. The only image that they have of Israelis are, apprehending their younger brother, or throwing tear gas, or whatever it may be, monitoring the checkpoints. And we think that that is not healthy, right? That if there is going to be a just and lasting end to this conflict, if there is going to be a future in which Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace, there has to be more engagement than just Palestinians knowing the Israelis as the military. Obviously, there are many Israelis that are working tirelessly for peace, so our support for Congresswoman McCollum in this legislation is really because we believe it's in Israel's best interest as well. We believe that it's in the interest of everyone when human rights are respected and when equality is achieved for all. So I don't know if that helps sort of, I think grounding it and really equality and human rights is helpful for us, because then it isn't about sides. It's about making sure that the systems and structures are in place so that there can be a thriving future in which both Israelis and Palestinians, regardless of what it looks like, we're not going to prescribe the solution to them, but as long as it's based in this human rights and equality, that helps us not have to frame it as being pro-Palestinian or being pro-Israeli.
Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. I see Nancy has her hand up, so Nancy, go ahead if you would.
Yeah, thanks. This is more of a comment than a question at this point, I think, but one of the things that I have observed through my friendships and my own experience in the region is that the tours that different faith communities take to the region are completely different many times. That many of the evangelical Christians don't really see Palestine and see what's happening at the border, barely get to Bethlehem, I think, or are unmoved by it for some reason. I have many very close Jewish friends who visit the region and come back and say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, everything's really wonderful. That's not the Israel I see. And then I find out where they've gone. And of course, it's not anywhere close to the West Bank or Gaza or some of the area, even East Jerusalem. So, I think trying to make that information known more broadly, that, there are two sides of this. I've spent a lot of time in Israel as well and have many Israeli friends. Most of them now, I would suggest, are probably in that category you were talking about, that are really trying to begin to work on peace and not very comfortable with where the country stands at the moment. But really, it's just a frustration of mine that these tours that are planned by different faith communities are radically different. And certainly you understand some of it's based on faith, but some of it is just head in the sand kind of thing. The other point that I was going to make is that this limiting of access issue goes both ways too. That we were trying to have a pilgrimage in March, and I was trying to get our group together with a group that we work with, and in fact just had a fundraiser for. It was News Story Leadership, a group that brings together Palestinian and Israeli 20-somethings to the United States every summer, and they are Christians and Muslim and Jewish young people in their late 20s. But in an effort to try to do that, we were told that there's almost no area that they could get the Israelis and Palestinians together, even in Area C, because at this point the PLA and the Hamas were going against the Arab students who wanted to come and join and be part of that. So these efforts to try to get them together are really challenging, and we need to find ways to continue to support those groups that are indeed focused on bringing particularly young people together, because I think we need to rely on the next generation to try to focus on these issues, I think, in a large degree. So I'll just stop at that point, sorry.
No, that's helpful comments. And I can just comment a little bit to your first point, especially in CMEP for the, so I mentioned earlier how we do pilgrimages to the region. We're open for churches that are interested in that. And we go through Mejdi tours. I'll link to them in the chat box, but they're a multi-narrative travel agency founded by an Israeli and a Palestinian, really with the hopes of showing that, I think it's, we don't want to say dual narrative because there's more than two, but multi-narrative that exposes you to both, so that when you go on a trip, you don't just come back and say, because it happens the other way too, of if they go mostly and spend time in the West Bank, they might come back and say, well, of course you're going to have that perspective. You didn't visit Israel. You didn't visit the areas close to Gaza where they have to deal with, the going in bomb shelters or whatever. And so that that then stops the conversation because people don't feel that your trip was legitimate or you were brainwashed or whatever from both sides, I think. And so Mejdi tours we use, I've led trips with CMEP with Mejdi tours. There's an Israeli tour guide and a Palestinian tour guide. Sometimes they do things together, other times separate, depending on where we're going. But we really try to expose you to viewpoints that you might also disagree with or that might make you uncomfortable, because that's how we grow in any situation, but especially relating to Israel-Palestine, you need to be exposed in order to be able to make an opinion on your own of what you think is the best way forward.
Okay. We have time for one, maybe two more questions, and I see John Ross has his hand up. So John, if you would go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Kyle, for joining us. This has been really fascinating and interesting. And by way of background, and I think you may know some of this, St. John's has been very engaged in humanitarian and educational efforts about the Holy Land. We support a full nurse's salary, for instance, at St. Luke's Nablus Hospital. We help them buy an ambulance. We recently contributed toward ventilators in Palestine. Amidst the COVID crisis, we support Ali. We do, anyway, a number of things on that front. We've had a number of forums, and this is a great part of that, to talk to folks. We support New Story Leadership, like Nancy mentioned, wonderful things. We are fairly new at getting involved in the justice end of things, the advocacy end of things. So I would like to ask you two questions. If you could please help us by articulating how most effectively our parish can be supportive of CMEP, and two, how just in general, how can St. John's as a parish be most effective in the world of advocacy for justice in the Middle East? And I know it's a big question, but I wanted to throw it at you specifically. Yeah. What can we do? Thank you.
Yes, thanks. It's a great question, and I'll be able to start the answer now, and I hope that means that we can have further conversations and hopefully at some point in person down the line. I would say, so for CMEP, we do yearly have our advocacy summits, and part of so it's a traditional conference, but then it includes one day of advocating with your congressional offices around an issue related to Israel-Palestine that's relevant on the Hill, that's relevant to Congress. And so I think some folks were able, we did a virtual summit this year. I think there might've been some folks from St. John's that were able to attend. But that's one way, sort of, as far as CMEP structures of advocating, that's where we show to congressional offices that we do have constituents that are backing up what we're saying. So participating in our advocacy summits is really helpful. We also do action alerts that I would encourage folks to sign up for. So that's a way, I'm sure that you all are familiar and do it with other issues perhaps, but where you can reach out directly to your congressional offices. We provide a sample script, but you can edit it as well to email your congressional offices on a particular issue. We have one right now on the Van Hollen Amendment, and I can drop it in the link. So signing up for action alerts, I think, is another way to make sure that when I go into the offices, I can say, you know, on the issue of the Van Hollen Amendment, we had 2,000 people send messages in support, right? That helps quantify when I go into an office. And when I'm talking about Congressman McCollum's legislation, I can go in and say, you know, I know that there are at least 60 constituents, I'm making up that number, from this district that support it and have written in support to you on this issue. So having those quantifiable numbers when we go into offices, I think is the first part of your question, how you can help CMEP. But I would encourage, so as far as advocacy right now, things are a little topsy-turvy with COVID of what's the most effective way, but really it's about developing relationships with your congressional offices. And so starting to try to have meetings with them virtually, with the staff members, getting to know them, establishing a relationship, having leaders of the St. John's community, faith leaders that can represent your community to congressional offices, so that they, I know that there are times where staffers will reach out to constituents and say, hey, the senator is about to give a statement on this issue. I know that it's important to you. I just wanted to give you a heads up. Or, hey, the senator is going to have a town hall in a couple of weeks, and I know that this is an important issue for you. We'd love for you to attend and maybe ask a question on Israel-Palestine, something like that. So it's really about developing a relationship with these offices, knowing their staff people, trying to set up right now virtual meetings, which we would be happy to help with for your members of Congress, so that they understand that this is an issue that really is of concern for their constituents. Because especially on a topic like Israel-Palestine, Senator Van Hollen has taken a strong stance, but they're only going to really do so if they feel that they have the backing of their constituents, and that the staffers can say, I know that, we have X amount of faith leaders in this district that I know are concerned and passionate about this issue, and will stand up and support if you do take this position. So I'm sorry, it's a hard question to answer in 5 minutes or so, but I hope that's a start. I also put my email, so please email me if you have any questions. This is also a link to the action alert that we have out around the Van Hollen amendment. So I hope that helped start the conversation, but please do reach out at any time.
Thanks, Kyle. I want to ask one last question, and that's, another thing that I think that we're grappling with in our work on the Holy Land Committee, and the way I'll illustrate this is when May came last October and she talked about the difference between advocating for justice and humanitarian assistance in terms of this kind of parable or story about a person drowning in the river, and the Good Samaritan goes over and saves this person from drowning, and all is well. But then another person comes down the river, and you have to go and save that person, and then another person, and you have to go save them. And so that's humanitarian assistance, which is necessary in the moment when someone is drowning. But social justice is realizing that there's some condition that's causing these people who can't swim to be in the river, and determining that you're going to go back and address that problem. And so the issue is, the question really is, at CMEP, how do you triage or prioritize limited resources of time and money to address one of these issues versus the other? Because our resources are limited. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, and everything is urgent. That's a good question, and I can only sort of begin to answer it now. For us, we go back to our policy positions, obviously, to see, how much of it is in line with the positions that we have. But for us, a defining question that we have is, what is CMEP's value add? If we decide to support a particular piece of legislation, or if we're going to be engaged in a campaign, are we bringing something substantive to the table that won't be there if we choose not to? And so that is a question we have to ask because of our limited resources, because there are so many issues related to Israel-Palestine that we could support. So it really comes back to us as, where can we make the most impact? And sometimes that's not, we might then have to pass up something that we think is really pressing and important, but we might not really have the expertise or the value add. It might be an issue in which having a faith voice is really critical, that the coalition isn't really focused on faith, on the faith community, and we would add that, as a value add to the issue. So it really, for us, has to go back to, where can we be most effective? The question, can we answer, if CMEP chooses to stay on the sidelines here, do we think that would have a negative impact on, this campaign, and then the flip side of, if CMEP does add our voice and does put our time and resources into it, where do we see us adding something that no one else can?
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. I think that's a great way of looking at it. And that's certainly helpful to me in thinking about it, and I think all of us on the Holy Land Committee. And I want to thank you again for coming today and your time, and very thoughtful and kind of holistic presentation about the work that CMEP is doing, as well as your offer to come back in the future so that we can follow up on this conversation.
Yes.
And I also want to add that you're the most adept person that I've seen in any of these presentations at putting, thoughts and links and so on into the chat rooms. So
I've had to do it a lot
up.
recently, so I've become accustomed, I guess. Yeah.
Very skilled.
Yeah.
And thank you everybody for joining us today. I think it was a really great discussion, and Kyle, we really appreciate it. Hope everybody has a great Sunday, and hope we can congregate in person soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Kyle.
Bye.
Thanks, Kirk. That was a great
Bye,
session.
everybody.